All right. Good morning. I'd like to call a meeting to order and acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Innu, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation and Treaty 3 territory. My name is Neil Harden. I'm chairing today's panel. With me in the room are Mike Colatruglio and Kira Penner. The assessor today is Justin Mikulik, and the administrative personnel is Francesca Picotto. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment rule in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the board. The board is appointed annually by council and is independent of it in the city administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with applicants following the swearing in. We'll then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions that the applicant may have, then applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all the evidence about an application be brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed. Recording will be part of the public record. We will be hearing item 2 and items 4 to 8 on our docket today. Ms. Picotto, please affirm the assessor's and applicant's testimony.
Mr. Assessor, please state your full name.
Justin Mikulik.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Applicant, please stand. Please state your full name.
Farah Cates.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
All right. The first item on today's agenda is 183 Maryland Street. So, Mr. Assessor, you may proceed.
Okay, so we have file number 24-1420, roll number 120-904-02000, roll year 2025, assessed value 864,000, classification 20, liability T. We could see here describing the property. It's a 2-story built in 1969, 11 suites. And if we keep scrolling down further to page 2, you could see there was a sale February 27th, 2020 for 952,000. And then the location here, which shows you a picture of where it is on a map relative on Maryland. So it's just south of Broadway. So it would be between like Maryland and Wolseley if you were looking at, or it would be between Broadway and Wolseley on Maryland. If you were looking at kind of the two main streets that it would be sandwiched between. If we keep going further here on page 3, we have our income value summary. So you could see where we come in on our average monthly rent per unit. And then it gives the income breakdown here on the next page. So, or on the column below, you could see where we are, gross potential rents, effective gross income 89,838, expenses 47,488 for a net operating income of 42,350. model cap rate 4.9% to come up with the $864,000. As we go further here, just on page 4, we presented some rent comparables of other similar properties in the area that have reported their income. And so you could see where this property on Maryland falls in line with others in the neighborhood. Between the range, so we're at 706 per unit on the income. And you could see just other rent comparables of similar properties when they were built, close in terms of the unit counts. So we feel pretty good there of where we're coming in on the income. When we proceed further to the cap rates on page 5, so you could see the multifamily column on page 5, just this is the 20th to 80th percentile of where our model falls in. The 20th to 80th percentile being 4.75% to 5.45%. Further on, we provide some cap rate evidence to support our model on page 6. So these are a sample of actual sales that took place during the reference periods. So we've stabilized these with 3-year history, and we've come up with the cap rates on the column on the right. So this is just to validate that the caps the models are producing are good, and they're supported by the batch of sales that we have. So we feel fairly confident of where our model cap comes in on this. And if we scroll down further here, just provided on page 8 their income slip. So this is their 2022 income. And so you could see their NOI down on page 9 comes out to 51,828. Our model's coming in at 42,350. So we're slightly below reported. The property did sell for $952,000 as well. So that kind of reaffirms too that we're probably okay at $864,000. Just provided some pictures from their website to give you an idea of what the suites look like. So you could tell the building's been maintained. Obviously, it's not an extravagant renovation, but it's obviously kept fairly well. And so yeah, 864,000 we feel that is reasonable for this property. That would conclude my presentation.
Okay, any questions, Madam Applicant?
Yes, thank you. So if we go to your cap rate table on page 5, in looking at your cap rate range, can you provide any information on the sales that are being used to achieve that, such as how many sales, location, etc.?
I don't know the exact number. I would just gather that it's sales that come through land titles that our modeling team would verify to produce that.
Okay. And so you have the 20th and 80th percentile here, but would it be fair to say that the higher end of the range, as in the 80th percentile and beyond, would be for a riskier property?
No.
So in the 3rd paragraph on this page, the broker cap rates are stated as further supporting the assessment department cap rates. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so when we're looking at the low rise B category, which would be like the subject, they're suggesting 5% is the minimum value. Is that correct?
They do state that.
So looking at this property specifically on page 2, you included a map. So the location is in West Broadway between Broadway and Sarah Avenue. Would you agree this would not be considered a desirable location by most people?
I would disagree with that notion. I think that's completely subjective.
Okay, so in your opinion, like areas with higher crime, that would be subjective?
I don't think that that necessarily affects the demand for people to rent these apartments.
So in looking at page 1, where you have some of the property features, At the date of physical condition of 2025, this property will be 56 years old with no effective age. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the property also does not contain enough parking stalls for each unit to park. Is that correct?
That's right.
And would you agree that around West Broadway, there tends to be time restricted parking for the street, as in you can't leave your car there all day?
I guess I don't know what this has to do with the property though.
Okay, so based on what we know about the broker cap rates and the subject property risk factors, do you believe that a 4.9% cap rate is sufficient to capture the risk of the property?
I mean, I would say that when we back it against the sale price, you could make a case that the cap rate may be too high.
So we turn to page 6, where you have your cap rate sales. So the purpose stated is to illustrate the accuracy of the model. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But out of the 12 cap rates, only about 4 of them are within the 20th to 80th percentile, where most of them are set to fall. Is that fair to say?
I think that's pretty fair to say.
And then in looking at your cap rates, several are falling quite low, between lower than 4.5% or 5% even. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
So if at the reference date, an investor could get a GIC at a return of 4.5%, which is very secure and low risk, would it make sense that the same investor would choose to enter into real estate, which is more risky, at a lesser rate?
Each individual person has their own desires for their portfolio, so there's a lot of factors that go in besides just only looking at risks, so.
Okay, and you haven't included the workups for the cap rates as part of your direct evidence, is that correct?
That is correct. I can verify they were stabilized here in the department, but we don't have the information submitted.
Okay, thank you. That would conclude my questions. And I would just ask if my cap rate questions could be carried forward to the remaining properties on the docket.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Colatriglio, any questions?
Mr. Sensor, I was wondering if you could explain why there was no effective age on this. Clearly, the apartments seem to be brought up to more modern standard. Is that, or am I just making an assumption on the pictures?
You know what? We haven't inspected this property, so I don't think it would be fair for us to just go and apply an effective year build based on just pictures from the website, and the property didn't have any permits, so it would be kind of not really good on our end to just automatically apply that without actually physically being inside the property and getting an idea of the extent of work that's been done. And there may have been when you see what the selling price was, but for now it's just gonna have to stay the way it is for this situation.
So mentioning the sell price, that was quite a bit higher than your assessment, is it not?
Yeah, that's correct.
You feel that the market dropped between the time of that sale and the current assessment that's on this? I know it's not a huge drop, but is there, does that make logical sense to you based on the market that's going on currently?
I definitely don't feel the market drop, but you know, this is a common occurrence with our department where the values we present for assessment, I think a lot of the time that you see a sale actually happen on these subject properties where our assessment does come in below or close to the sale price in reality. So you know what, this is something that we're gonna definitely have to look at going forward with this property if it is something that does require some effective year built bump. But I can say that we are fairly accurate on the income of what they have reported to us. So it's hard to say what they base the sale price on. Maybe it was something else, but I would think that like unless it's just a cap rate issue of where maybe the cap's too high on our model and but I'm not gonna go adjust that. I mean,
Yeah.
situation.
Well, is it possible though that potentially the effective age may need to be brought up to maybe assist the model in coming up with a slightly higher potentially rent, but it appears the rents are not out of line when you look at the comparables that you've shown.
Yes, no, that's definitely correct.
Okay, those are my questions.
Okay, Ms. Banner, any questions?
No, I think all of my questions have been covered off already. Thank you.
Okay, on the sale, was it a standalone sale or as far as you know?
As far as I know, it transacted through land titles with a sworn value and sale price that's looks okay, but again, I didn't have time to really dig into the extent of the sale. I didn't see a mailer submitted, so
Okay, so you don't, was it arm's length as far as you know?
that's as far as I know it is, but I don't have all the proof to
Okay.
verify that.
All right, I have no more questions, so Ms. Applicant, you can proceed with your presentation.
Okay, thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have a summary of the facts of the property as well as our requested assessment of $695,000. On page 6, we've included some maps and exterior photos of the subject, so you could see the aerial view as well as the location on the map. So if you go to page 8, we have our property description. So the subject property is located on the east side of Maryland Street between its intersections with Broadway and Sarah Avenue in the West Broadway area. I believe the assessor has covered most of the facts of the property, but I would note that it has 11 units, which are all 1 bedroom, and there are 7 outdoor parking stalls noted. So if you turn to page 13, we have the start of our income approach. So the NOI is fairly similar. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but we do have some discussion on page 13 surrounding the effective gross income and the expense allowance that we're using. So I'll just skip ahead to page 14, where we look at the cap rate. So we are disputing the assessor's cap rate of 4.90%. We're using a cap rate of 6% based on our cap rate study. So when we're looking at this property, it had the structural age of 1969. Our cap rate range would start at 5.75. And considering the lack of parking and as well the location, I've moved it within the range up from 5.75 to 6%. So if you turn to page 16, we have our income workup. So in terms of how we typically stabilize apartments, you'll see we have columns for 3 years of data. So we'll use the most recent year for income. So we'll stabilize based on the 2022 income. And then for expenses, we typically have 3 years. In this case, we only have 2 years, 2020 and 2022. But the idea with the expenses is that we would typically use the most recent year, except in cases where the expenses were thought to fluctuate a little bit, such as in categories of professional fees, office supplies, repair and maintenance. Where it's not stated in the remarks column, it could just be assumed that we're using the most recent year. So things like insurance and taxes typically go up each year. So that is why we would use the most current year. So in terms of the cap rate, I would like to briefly go through the cap rate study. which is our separate document that I've submitted.
Yeah. Yep,
So-
go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so in the cap rate study, if you turn to page 2, we have an overview of the cap rates. The main point from this page is that the cap rate is inclusive of 3 major items, which would be perceived risk, expectations for income appreciation, and the required return on other investment vehicles. The next few pages have some further background information on the legislation, as well as on certain IAAO standards for cap rate sales, which you can review if you wish. But I'll just move forward to page 5. So in the middle of page 5, we have the entirety of the multifamily cap rate range, which is 3.5 to 7.95. So one of the points I was trying to bring out in questioning is that for properties that are riskier or have some feature that would make them more atypical, going beyond the 80th percentile would make sense for those properties, and the range goes up to 7.95%. And that is from the valuation manual that's put out by the city.
Excuse me, what page are you on?
Page 5 of the cap rate study,
Of the cap rate study, and that is.
separate document,
Ah, my fault.
sorry,
Sorry, I was wondering where you were
jumping around.
jumping around.
Yeah, just let me know when you're there.
Ah, there we are. Sorry.
So beneath that so toward the bottom of page 5, we have a chart just showing what the brokers are saying. So you'll see that Colliers and Cushman, they just have a single low rise category. They don't break it out, but they're showing no compression from last cycle. They're showing rates of starting at 5% to a top end of 5.75 to 6%. CBRE is a bit more optimistic. They break it out between low rise A and low rise B. I would suggest the subject property and all the remaining properties on the docket would be more of a low rise B. And they're showing more compression, but that would typically be for what would be considered the best of the best stock, which I would suggest is not what we're looking at here. So on page 6, we started discussion on cost of borrowing and interest rates. So I won't go through it in painful detail, but what I would point out is that at the reference date, we know that the Bank of Canada rate was 4.50%. So if an investor could get a low risk secure GIC for 4.5%, it just logically doesn't make sense that they're going to invest in real estate, which is known to be a moderate to higher risk asset, at a lower or similar rate of return. So I would advise to use caution when seeing cap rate sales that are in the range of, sub 4, like lower than 4.5, because clearly there is something else going on with those sales. So if you could turn to page 9, we have some discussion on the factors that we might consider to adjust our base cap rates. So not all the factors would be relevant to every property type, but some that we'll be looking at today would include age, lack of parking, and location. And these factors can increase the risk of the property. So if you turn to page 11, we have our sale chart of the capitalization rates that we've calculated. So our sale chart indicates a range of 5.26% to 7.11%. I would suggest the more comparable cap rates would be 677 Maryland, which is in West Broadway, same location. Structurally, it is quite aged, so it would match in those features. The newer properties probably wouldn't be as pertinent to today's discussion, but I would suggest 345 Talbot and 738 St. Mary's would also be valid cap rates to consider. So when we're doing our cap rate analysis, we try to maintain as consistent as possible with our valuation methodology that we would apply in our standard valuations, which would be stabilizing based on actual income and expenses where available, But sometimes if those are not available, we'll rely on market information such as CMHC rents and vacancy, or property specific information such as what the brokers are saying or pro formas, etc. If you turn to page 12, we have a chart summarizing sale price per suite, and we have the backup data in Appendix E. So what I would suggest is that these can provide a gauge, something else to look at in terms of the value of the property. But there should be some caution taken with trying to do direct comparisons with sale price per suite of sales with the subjects that we're going to be looking at, because if you're not doing proper adjustments, that kind of direct comparison approach can lose some reliability. So toward the middle of page 12, we have our summary of our cap rates that we're using, our base cap rates, and these would be contemplating good quality properties in good locations. And that kind of concludes the body of the report. And then I'll just reference what pages you could find in the appendix, just in case you wanted to review it. So Appendix A is on page 13. That's the backup for the city valuation parameters that we were discussing. Page 16, Appendix B, that contains the broker market reports from Q1 21 and Q1 23. Appendix C starts on page 22, and that's some of the backup documentation we were using for the factors. The longest appendix would be Appendix D, that starts on page 34, and that is our cap rate calculations and the backup documentation for each sale. And then finally on page 97, we have Appendix E, which is the backup data of the sale price per suite, and it's broken down by age category. So I'll just go back to the main brief just to tie up this presentation on this property. So back on the main brief on page 16, you'll see our net operating income, $41,707, fairly similar in NOI. It's really just a matter of cap rate. And so when we apply our 6% cap rate, we get a value of $695,000. Page 17 shows our repair and maintenance data that we were using. So typically we would stabilize based on a multi-year stabilization, 5 years where we can. In this case, we had 3 years of data. And then what we'll do with the repair and maintenance is certain categories, you'll see there's a max value per suite from the right-hand side of the page. So certain categories will cap at values based on discussions with property managers and what seems like an appropriate value. So this would have been based on our discussions, the 500, 225, those cap values. And then for the remainder, we'll stabilize based on what seems like appropriate amounts, or if there's outliers, we'll remove those. So we have a repair and maintenance of 1857 a suite, not necessarily under contention here, but that's going to be the methodology for the remainder of the properties with the repair and maintenance. And that would conclude the presentation. Page 19 has the appendix, some interior photos, and then all the financials that we used. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Assessor, any questions?
Which way do we want to question first, on the property or the cap rate analysis?
It's your choice. It's all part of her presentation, so.
Okay. Okay, so just going to the cap rate analysis. So you don't have any properties that have a 3-year stabilization of reported income to the city of Winnipeg?
No, we did not have 3 years of data.
Okay, so you couldn't find one sale in the last couple years that would have that information?
No, we looked at all of the land title sales, and based on data we had that we felt was appropriate to stabilize, that's how we came to our stabilization. So as you know, not every property has data to use. So we kind of rely on either properties that were former client properties or current in order to get that data.
Just So just turning here to page 5 regarding the market reports, I know like a lot gets said about how these companies have their ranges of cap rates. Are like, would you say that they're using the same data that the city of Winnipeg gets, where people are reporting actual income and expenses, or would it be relying on more like a real estate pro forma from an agent?
I would say the brokers are typically known to have more investment grade properties in terms of how they complete their stabilizations. I can't say. I'm not sure if they would have your 3 years of data that you're referring to, maybe a year of data. But broker information is typically seen as being fairly reliable.
Would you agree that when you have a cap rate sale price, that the higher the net operating income is, once you stabilize, the higher the cap rate's gonna be?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Once you have a cap rate sale price, would you agree that the higher the net operating income that you stabilize at, the higher the cap rate's going to be?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so turning to your brief here regarding this one on cap rate. Just because I know income we seem to be pretty close on, so just discussing the cap rate application. So would you say, like, how does parking affect cap rate in terms of risk, right? When we're talking about the element of risk, when you say that there's not enough parking, would you care to expand on that?
For sure. So parking goes to desirability of the property. If there is a lack of parking, that can increase the risk because if tenants don't have where to park, they might not find the property as desirable as properties where there is adequate parking. So if you're at that less to 1-to-1 ratio, and on top of that, your street parking is time restricted and limited, it could increase the risk of the property. It wouldn't be considered as desirable.
Okay, so in your cap rate sales, can you verify that that's actually factual?
As in, to clarify the question, as
To
in,
be applying a higher cap rate because there's less parking?
yeah, well, I think it is verified in the cap rates when we look at a property like 677 Maryland, which is very similar location, would have similar issues with parking, and we see quite a high cap rate. So all those risk factors that we talk about in terms of our valuation, those would be baked into the cap rates already, in terms of the final value of the cap rates that we calculated.
Wouldn't you see demand as in terms of vacancy as more of a risk though than in terms of like parking? Like if people are taking up the parking or renting, does parking, like, I just struggle with parking being rolled into cap rate. So would you see that maybe measuring vacancy and demand on the property be a better way to gauge risk as opposed to, say, some of these other applications of these attributes?
Well, typically what we're doing, when we're doing our valuation, we're using the actual income they're achieving, either a market vacancy or a 3-year average vacancy, and the actual expenses. So where we're accounting for that risk is in the cap rate. That's where we're choosing to account for it.
And just going back to the cap rate study, when you say that, like, I see CBRE has gone down in cap rate change year over year. You had said that this is only the best of the best stock. However, we all see the properties that have sold over the last couple years. So I'm just struggling, I guess, like where would you see that, like, they would have other properties that we don't?
So I think there's a couple things there. No, I don't believe I said they have properties you don't. our view is that where there is compression on the cap rates for multifamily, that it is for the top quality, best stock. It would not be for kind of lower end, or aging kind of apartment stock.
Okay, those are all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Banner, any questions?
Oh, sorry, that's me. I guess my main question is just some kind of explanation as to the difference between the sale price a few years ago versus the current value is, what would you attribute that to?
Yeah, that's a fair question. In terms of the sale price, the first thing I would say is that the market from 2020 has changed. And that's kind of speaking to the rising interest rates and kind of that first section of the cap rate study. So the market has changed from 2020 to the reference date, and we do know that. And then the second point I would attribute is that we do see that with some of these smaller properties that what they thought they were purchasing, it didn't necessarily come to fruition. One example of that in our cap rate study would be 677 Maryland, where we see each purchaser was purchasing it at a lower price because the opportunity just wasn't realized. It wasn't what they had thought it would be. So yes, they did pay $952,000, but based on our income workup in terms of the income they're bringing in, their actual expenses, and what we feel is an appropriate cap rate, those values just don't match, and we feel that our income stabilization of what they're actually achieving would be a more accurate depiction of the value.
That's all for me, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Colatriglio, any questions?
Yes, going to your, you're referencing 677 Maryland. Again, it is a 32 unit building. And certainly, it has the same issues as the subject in that when it was built, along with most of the older stock that's in Winnipeg, parking was never at a one-to-one basis for the units, ever. Is that correct? A fair statement to make?
Yeah, I would definitely agree when we're looking at the really aged stock like Maryland, but since the subject is more 1960s, I do feel that the parking requirements had somewhat changed, but I would agree with the sentiment that West Broadway, Wolseley, typically like downtown, gonna run lower in parking.
And that effect is, I think what the assessor was trying to ask was, where do you see that effect in the cap rate? But that's a very difficult question, is it not? To try and quantify what parking or lack of parking or excess parking would do to evaluation.
Yeah, and that's one of the fun parts of our job is just because cap rate is the more subjective part of the analysis. So trying to quantify all of those features. But what I would say with my cap rate adjustment is that it's more so for location, but noting the parking as well. You'll see with the remainder of the properties have been consistent with that adjustment for location, and noting that parking is kind of an issue with several of those.
And I also note that you have added parking to your valuation as there's some income from it, and the assessor is not. Though I think at the end of the day, between the two positions, your net operating incomes are virtually identical, within a few $100s of each other. So it appears that the dispute that we have is basically cap rate, and you're suggesting 6 is more attributed to this type of a property, yet I'm seeing from the assessor's report that some of the cap rates that he provided for similar types of areas seem to all have, they're all close to the cap rate that he's looking at as opposed to 6s, which you're at. Can you try and help me justify that? And I appreciate that you've looked at the outside sources, but you have not, you don't know what the outside sources have included in those numbers, correct?
That would be correct, but I would say that the assessor is also using those broker reports and they also don't know where theirs are coming from.
And I'll agree with you to that point, but he's also provided additional information on page 6 of actual cap rate calculations, none of which are greater than 5.75%. And certainly there's going to be obviously there's a range. There's going to be some higher, some lower, everything in between, and there's always going to be the 20% on each side that are the outliers. And I appreciate that. But can you justify how your position at 6%, basically just looking at the outside sources, makes more sense than looking at some of the actuals specific?
Well, we've provided a whole cap rate study where we do look at actuals. But what I would say about the assessor's cap rates, to some of the points I was making before, is we don't agree with those cap rates that they're putting out. And quite frankly, they haven't provided any calculations to support those cap rates, whereas we're very transparent and we provide everything, which does open up, some room to critique, of course. I appreciate your point that there is a range, but we don't look at the assessor's evidence for cap rates in terms of coming to our own conclusions.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay, and all my questions have been asked and answered. Does either party wish a submission on this property? Mr.
I'm okay.
Assessor.
I'm okay, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Applicant.
If I may just do a summation at the end of the docket, that would be great.
Okay, all right, fine. We will go to 640 Westminster then. Let me just open the files. Okay, Mr. Assessor, you can begin.
Okay, we have file number 241499, roll number 12090788000. Roll year 2025, assessed value 1,566,000, classification 20, liability T. We have a 3-story, 1 building built in 1909, 15 suites. And if we scroll further here to location on page 2, you could see where it's situated. Similar type neighborhood as the prior property, just over on Westminster. So you could see south of Broadway, kind of like between that Broadway and Wolseley type main arteries. Scrolling down further, page 3, you could see our income value summary. So we come up to average monthly rent of 1,004. Gross potential rent comes in at 180. Less our vacancy to get our gross income effective 174,292, less the expenses 91,294, and we get our net operating income 82,998. Cap rate applied in this situation through the model 5.3% to get our market value. I have provided rent comparables again, just to show where this property would fall in line to other properties in the neighborhood with similar type suite counts, suite mixes, that sort of thing. Cap rates, we had just touched on where the city falls. I don't think I need to touch on page 5 again. Page 6 again, this reaffirms that our model cap generation is okay relative to sales that we presented and stabilized. And if we scroll further down to page 8, you could see that they provided us with their 2022 income statement and that their total income 166,644. We go down, see their expenses 86,113, a total NOI of 80,530. Our model parameters are estimating at 82,998. I mean, that's like a 0.25% difference. So we're pretty bang on this one to where I don't really feel that there's enough need to adjust any of those parameters on the income. And the model generated cap 5.3, again, I see that as totally reasonable. I wasn't able to get any pictures. There was no permits, just a picture from the website of the property that I was able to garner. So that would conclude my presentation on this one.
Okay, questions, Ms. Applicant?
Just a couple, thank you. So the property, having been built in 1909, is structurally over 100 years old. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And it's also wood frame. Would you agree that that would not necessarily be considered as high quality of a material as masonry?
It must be pretty good quality if it's still standing.
That would. my
The
new
building
question.
seems sound, so I don't know. I have trouble saying yes to that statement.
Okay, sounds good. That would conclude my questions. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Colatriglio, any questions?
You're looking at a 5.3% cap rate. I guess, would that be part of the reason that is a wood structure as opposed to a masonry structure building?
I don't know if that type of attribute would go into creating the cap rate. Those things are kind of proprietary that I don't have that information.
Think it's possible?
I mean, if you're doing it yet, like it is certainly an attribute that they could build in for sure, based on comparing it to, say, a masonry.
And you also mentioned that there were no permits taken on this property.
None that I could see.
You think a building from 1909 might have had some updates or upgrades made to it through the years? I kind of believe some have been done.
I'm sure based on what they're charging for rent, that yes, that there probably has been some type of updating, and given that you see the income that they are actually reporting, it probably isn't a 1909. It probably would be appropriate to put effective year built, but again, unless I'm inspecting, I would have no idea what to apply on the property.
Maybe it's time to have a look at this one.
Those I don't disagree, and the time could come up down the line here where that could be looked at.
There are 5 parking stalls in this particular building, correct?
That's correct.
And the income, I believe, is that they provided, didn't provide a breakdown of the actual income. It just seems to be one global number.
Yeah, they just only put in rental income.
Gotcha.
So I wouldn't know what they're actually garnering from parking on this one.
Okay, those are my questions.
Like, unless it's a situation where it might be included in the few people that are actually renting those spots, it may be just lumped in with the rent.
And just maybe just one other question. Some of these older properties don't not necessarily have people that are have cars, etc. Would that be a fair statement to make?
Absolutely. You're seeing, and so that's where I circle back to demand, right? If the property, regardless of if it has parking or not, if it still sees the demand where tenants are still renting it and there's stable income with the rents, I don't see how parking circles into a cap rate application, as opposed to it's just an income situation where here's income on the property. So that's a fair statement to make. And also this area, this Broadway area, you typically can get a lot of renters that may not need vehicles, where they like you're really close to transit, you're within walking distance of a lot of retail, workplaces, etc. So that's where I would come at with the parking there.
Thank you.
Hey, Ms. Penner, any questions?
When it says the effective year, like the subject property, the effective year is the same as the actual year built, is that the same for your comparables as well? Or are these older building, like is the effective age, or has the effective age been brought up from the actual age based on condition?
So these like, so you're talking the rent comparables on page 4.
Yes.
I don't know exactly what it could be. Like there could be a couple of them that might have updates on them, because they are also in an older area, so it would make sense. Like if the building, like a lot of these buildings were built in early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, but I wasn't able to check that out at this point. But the income that they reported to us, like further, made me realize that we are okay when we're still verifying against the model. So I didn't really see it as being too much of a concern.
That's fair. And then I noticed that there's a row indicating heat included in the rent, and a few of them do include the heat, but there's no notation as to the subject property. I'm assuming because that's a stabilized rental rate, but is there any consideration made to that, like any kind of deduction made for any utilities included in those rental rates?
You know what? It's just utilizing their actual expenses when we look at it on a case by case basis, and if the expenses kind of can match up to where our model's coming in, we kind of just look at it as overall, like we think we're reporting a good net operating income that's reflective of this property. When you look at their expenses on page 8, I don't know if they would necessarily be maybe they included for the year, just judging by those numbers. I'm not quite sure where it says heat, gas, and propane, 23,085. My guess is heat would be included in their rents. But I don't,
Then just
they don't state that. We do ask for owners to put that when they submit income and expenses, they could check off what's included, but this one did not.
That's fair. And then just in regards to your vacancy rate, do you have any, is there any sort of record about the vacancy associated with this particular property, or is it always just a stabilized rate that's applied based on the asset type?
So we look at, again, data that comes in through CMHC, and then also what individual property owners report to us when they submit their income and expenses. So when we enter that, we could see here, like with this property specifically, it doesn't appear that there's vacancy with it when you look at the numbers, but I mean, maybe there is. They don't really parse that out. And again, it's something that we do ask for when we get when we send out the income and expenses, but they don't always get returned to us exactly with a property owner filling in their vacancy, etc. I can see they give discounts here, but I don't know if this line 5100, that's their rental income. I don't know if that's because they're fully occupied and there's no vacancy. They don't really state that. But the vacancy applied to remodels like a market rate based on, it would factor in CMHC.
That's all for me, thank you.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of vacancy, you use the market rate unless there's an indication of a chronic vacancy with the property. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say that that's probably the most appropriate because we're trying to get a picture of market value, right? So if you're thinking of, say, buying this property, okay, would someone buying it when they're doing their own stabilization before they're purchasing the property, would they really be applying a 20% vacancy? Probably not. Right, so we would tend to circle back to using a market number in almost all situations.
Okay, thank you very much. Miss Applicant, you can proceed with your presentation.
Okay, thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have our requested value of $1,205,000. We have the aerial maps and Google map on page 6, as well as an exterior photograph of the property on page 7. The property description on page 8. So the subject property is located on Westminster Avenue at the southwest corner of its intersection with Langside Street in the West Broadway area. The property was built in 1909. Although there is an effective age of 1911, but I would assume that's more of an entry thing on the city's behalf. The property has 15 units, which includes 2 1-bedrooms, 9 2-bedrooms, and 4 3-bedrooms, and there is no parking on the property. So we have our income approach starting on page 13. So it's really just a cap rate issue. There's only a small discrepancy on the NOI. So if you turn to page 14, we have our discussion on the cap rate. We are disputing the assessor's cap rate of 5.30%, and we're using a cap rate of 6.50% based on our cap rate study. So structurally, the property is from 1909. Even if there have been some updates to units over the years, which clearly there would be, given its age, the structure, the bones of the property is over 100 years old, and that's not something that can be changed. When we look at building material, wood frame is inferior to masonry. This is shown when you do a cost valuation on properties. There's going to be more deterioration on the wood frame ones. Those will come out lower value than masonry or concrete. So it is considered a lower quality material. The property has no amenities, no parking, it's primarily larger suites, and we are considering the location to be a factor in the analysis. So we're within our range at 6.50%. I went to the higher end of the range due to both the location as well given the age. Some of the other properties we're going to be hearing today are a bit newer. So given that our range is pre-1946, 1909 is quite a bit before then. So I felt that that made a good case to go toward the higher end of the cap rate range. So if you go to page 16, we have our breakdown. So you'll see that the way they report their income, they just report it as like an effective income. So the vacancy is already included. So that doesn't mean that there's necessarily no vacancy, but just that their reporting style, it is included in already. And that's not uncommon for some of the properties we're going to be seeing today. Again, our NOI, we have 78,329. So not much of a difference there with the city. And with our 6.5% cap rate, that gives our value of $1,205,000 rounded. We have our repair and maintenance breakdown on page 17 for your review. And then the appendix starts on page 19, and we've included the city valuation page as well as the financials that we've referenced in our analysis. And that would conclude my presentation on this property. Thank you.
Okay, questions, Mr. Assessor?
Just the discussion regarding how the type of construction gets applied to the cap rate in terms of, I think maybe a premium was added on your end. Is that verified through the cap rate sales?
So in terms of the cap rate I applied here, I wasn't necessarily applying a premium for wood frame. It's more so considering the structural age being as old as it is, as well as the location, which is why I went to the higher end of the range. But it is our opinion that wood frame is an inferior material to masonry concrete. And that's just factual, that it does deteriorate faster than those other materials.
Okay, now just in regards here, I know we talk about the structure being older now. When you look at the rents, have you inspected this property?
I did not have the opportunity to inspect this property.
Okay, so you would not have any idea of the work potentially that could be done inside the property to maybe have updated it past the 1909?
I acknowledge that there likely has been work done to the suites. I don't have the confirmation of what exactly has been done. But my point is that even if you've done work to the suites, it doesn't change the fact that the structure of the building is so aged. And given that you don't have permits showing that the structure has been updated in any meaningful way to prolong the life, the economic life is going to be linked to the structure.
Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Benner, any questions?
In just referencing your cap rate study, do we know if those properties that you've referenced are wood frame or masonry construction?
I don't have that in front of me. I would have to look into it.
That was all for me. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Colatriglio.
I was just looking at the picture of the apartment. It does appear that windows are newer quality than original windows, I'm assuming. So I think I agree with you that something has obviously been done to this building through the years. But unfortunately, you haven't inspected it, neither has the assessor. That
Yeah.
appears to be the case.
Yeah, I would expect you'd have to do certain updates over 1909, or else probably no one would want to live in the property, I think.
And
Yeah.
obviously somebody's living there because it appears that it doesn't have a vacancy issue, correct?
Yeah, it doesn't appear the last recorded vacancy in 2021 was about 2.2%, so maybe a little below market. So yeah, I wouldn't say it has a vacancy issue. A lot of times property owners are going to make that decision with where to put the rents so that they can mitigate their vacancy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wouldn't say there's a vacancy issue.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay, in terms of that latter point, this property seems to be getting, let's put it this way, higher rents, considering the area that they're in. Certainly higher rents than the previous property we did. Does that not reflect that it's a decent property, and should that not be reflected in the cap rate?
Yeah, so a couple points with the rent. So this property does have a higher proportion of larger suites. It's mostly 2 and 3 bedrooms, whereas the initial property we did was mostly 1 bedrooms. So that will have a big impact on the rent potential and the rent ceilings in there. And then in terms of the condition, because I had not had an opportunity to inspect it, I'm not really considering the condition to be a factor for any type of adjustment. I'm assuming that it's in somewhere between average to good condition, as the properties for this manager typically would be. So yeah, it's more so the age and the location rather than the condition. Because I would imagine that, kind of as we've talked about, that suites would be upgraded over time to bring them up to be a bit more modern.
Yeah, things like appliances and flooring and that sort of thing would probably have been done since 1909. They probably don't have wood stoves anymore. Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to uh, 138 Young Street. Let me open the files. All right, Mr. Assessor, on 138 Young Street, you can begin.
Okay, so we have file number 24-1261, roll number 12090973500, roll year 2025, assessed value 1.338 million, classification 20, liability T. We have again a one building, 3-story, built in 1911, 16 suites, 12 parking, no effective year built. If we scroll to page 2, you could see the location very similar to the last couple that we've been discussing in that area just south of Broadway. Now we go to page 3 where we present our income workup, so you could see where it comes out on a price per unit, $838.61. And then to gather our income workup being the gross rents of $161,000, less vacancy, effective gross income $155,000, and our expense ratio of just shy of 85,000 to get a net operating income of 70,236. Applying a 5.25% cap rate to get our overall capitalized income of 1,338,000. Page 4 just shows rent comparables again of similar properties in the neighborhood of where the rents fall on the spectrum. I would say that we're pretty close on the reported income for rents, so it does fall in place with other properties, but at the end of the day, we kind of still revert back in this case to more what they've been reporting to us. So I would say that it still falls in line with other properties, but we'll still say that what they reported, we're gonna stick with that as the primary driver of verifying that our income's good. We've discussed here on page 5 the cap rate for multifamily. I don't think we need to touch on that. We know, so this is 5.25. It just falls kind of right in the middle between the 4.75 and the 5.45. Cap rate evidence we went through again. Don't think I need to touch on it again, as this is in the exact same neighborhood within a few minute walk. So we could just scroll down to page 8. They give a breakdown here of the rents. They have a bunch of operating expenses that they list out. I adjusted, so for this, I just took out depreciation and interest expenses, which we wouldn't include in an income and expense calculation. And then, so once you remove that, the NOI works out to 75,419, and our model works out to 70,236. So again, I don't feel any need on this one to have to adjust it any further. I think the cap rate's well applied and I think our income's good, so there won't be any changes to this one from our end. And that is all for my presentation.
All right, questions, Ms. Applicant?
I have no new questions. All of my previous questions surrounding cap rate and age can just carry forward. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Colatrigio, any questions?
I'm just noting that there are 12 parking stalls, correct? And
Yeah,
most-
that's what we have.
Right, and again, the effective year is not changed from the original age.
I mean, yeah, it's fair to say that probably all these ones could be adjusted to some degree if we were able to inspect all of them. I mean, it would probably allow us to have maybe a better valuation on it. But yeah, until then, I can't just apply that, right?
I appreciate that. An inspection would certainly go a long way in these properties where it appears that things have changed through the years.
If I had a greater time between when I get the Board of Revision to when I have to submit evidence that I can inspect it, I would love to be able to inspect all these.
Mr. Mikulak, as a former assessor, I know your pain, but I will tell you, you have to sometimes make pain happen and go out, have a look at a few of these properties. When you've got a 1911 building, gee, an effective age you don't think would have been applied at some point? I mean, truthfully, I know there's time is an issue, I get it, but just suggesting.
Just reality.
Indeed. And again, you're at a 5.25% cap rate on this particular property?
That's correct.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Benner.
So since it seems the consistent thread here is the cap rate question, I understand you're working in a model based methodology. Is there any like when you see your cap rate comparables on page 6 of your brief, is there any consideration given to particular properties that might be more relevant, or is it just strictly within the confines of the model that these are all being inputted?
So we look at when a model submits a value that these cap rate sales that we've verified and stabilized at least would support a range of value or like a number that comes out to say, okay, if it comes out at 5.25 and we look at the range of cap rates from the last few years, that the 5.25 number falls in place, then, and sometimes it may not be exact on the property, but when we're talking about a mass appraisal entity here, this is how we can verify that, hey, the model's producing a cap rate that is valid based on what we've looked at through actual sales. So that's where our cap rate number comes from. And so you might see a little bit of variation from property to property, but at the end of the day, it still falls in line to being acceptable from a mass appraisal standpoint.
When I look at these cap rates, 2.99 to 5.75 is quite a significant range, and if that's in our 20 to 80% of the data, it's, I guess, what am I trying to ask? Just how we sort of pinpoint it within that broad of a range, but if that's how the model is generated, then I understand that. So thank you. That's all for me.
Okay.
All right, and I have no questions, so Ms. Applicant, you can begin your presentation.
Thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have our requested assessment of $1,167,000. On page 6, we have the aerial map and Google map, as well as some exterior photographs on page 7. On page 8, we have our property description. So the subject property is located on the west side of Yonge Street at its intersection with Sarah Avenue. It is built in 1911. There are 16 units, which include 2 one-bedroom and 14 two-bedroom, and there are 12 outdoor parking stalls noted. We have our income approach starting on page 13. Again, it's more of a cap rate issue. Our NOI is actually slightly higher due to slightly higher income based on the actuals. So on page 14, we have our discussion on cap rate. We are disputing the assessor's cap rate of 5.25%. We are using a cap rate of 6.25% based on our study and following a similar logic of the prior property. The structural age is 1911, which would put us within a range of 6.1 to 6.6%. We note that this is a masonry construction. There is 0.75 stalls per unit. So a better parking ratio than the last property, but the location is still an issue in West Broadway. So we're at 6.25% for this property. I think an important point on cap rate to note would be that most of the apartment stock in Winnipeg is built in 1960s, 1970s era. So when we have properties that are this old, they're not the typical apartment. And when we're looking at what the market's saying for what a typical cap rate, they're kind of in, 5 to 6 range. So if we're with a property that's atypical, it's a lot older than standard, limited economic life left compared to newer properties, that would put us on the higher end of that range or slightly on the top of that range. And that kind of all fits together. So if you turn to page 16, we have our valuation workup. So you'll see that they report just an effective gross income. They don't show the breakdown. So we're using their effective gross income of $159,466. With the expenses stabilized, including repair and maintenance at 1423 a suite, we have total expenses of $86,498. With a 6.25% cap rate, that is what gives us our value of $1,167,000 rounded. We have our repair and maintenance breakdown on page 17 for your review. And then our appendix starts on page 19, and that includes some interior photographs, some marketing photographs that I located on the website. So this would probably be what a nicer suite would look like, because this is their what they're using for marketing purposes. And then I also have the city valuation page and all of the financials that we considered for our valuation. And that would conclude my presentation on this property. Thank you.
Okay, questions, Mr. Assessor? Are you muted?
No, I was just looking at.
Oh, you're just thinking, okay.
No, you know what? I think my questions from previous properties that were identical to this would carry over.
Okay.
As it
Miss-
relates to the cap rate.
Yeah. Ms. Benner, any questions?
No questions for me, thank you.
Mr. Colatriglio?
Thank you. This one does have interior pictures, and it does seem to show something that's been modernized through the years. Would you not agree that that has extended potentially the economic life of this property?
I would say modernizing the units is helpful for reducing turnover and attracting tenants and being able to achieve the higher end of your rents. But I do not believe that adding new counters or new flooring is extending the life of the structure because it's not foundation. It's not, the load bearing capacity. So I don't believe that it extends the life, but I do think it helps them attract tenants and achieve higher rents.
Now, did you inspect this property?
I did not inspect this property. These are from the website.
Fair enough. Were you made aware of by the owner that they were having structural issues in this particular property?
No, there was no mention of structural issues.
I'm looking through the pictures just to see if I can pick anything up. It actually looks fairly pristine in terms of what it is, hardwood floors and oak trim, etc. I don't see anything that would bring question to structural issues. Just curiosity more than anything. And that's why I was asking the question if you had inspected it or heard of any issues regarding that, but that appears not to be the case, so. And again, you're at a cap rate of 6.25, and you feel that because of the fact that it's an older building, correct?
And it's in an inferior location, yes.
Would you agree that certainly there's going to be a range of locations? There's going to be the ultra high end newer units that are being built to older stock that's in the city. Both are equally sought after by people in those areas because of the fact that they're in those areas. Do you agree with me?
I don't agree that all areas would be equally sought after. It's not that there's no market for West Broadway, but when you're looking at what most people would consider, typically West Broadway is going to be attracting tenants based on more budgetary constraints. It is known to have kind of more transiency with tenants as well. So I would suggest even when looking at its adjacent neighborhood, Wolseley, it's a lot less attractive. So I would say there's always going to be a market for different areas, but it would be more so under budgetary constraints rather than a big desire to live there.
You think that there'd be a big difference between West Broadway and the Wolseley area in terms of rentals for apartments?
Yes, Wolseley has kind of undergone more of a transformation, and it's kind of seen as more of a modern area among younger people. And even among the same streets, you see differences between being Westminster at, by Young and Westminster further out. So I think Winnipeg is very much a street by street, kind of block by block city. And that's something to consider in the analysis.
Fair enough, thank you.
Okay, with, I guess, picking up on that latter line of questioning, would it be fair to say that all these apartments we're dealing with today, especially, well, all of them, are more geared towards people who are looking for more affordable rents than say a lot of other apartments would be. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I believe that would be fair.
Okay, and so say an investor wouldn't be looking at buying this property, upgrading it, and expecting to pull in $1,500 a month rents on them.
Yeah, there's going to be limitations. Even if one did renovations, there would likely have to be discounts applied depending on what the property was achieving before. So yes, like, could you achieve the same rents you could around Corden? Probably not.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much then. It's 25 after 10, so we'll take a break till 22:11, a 15-minute break.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll resume the hearing. Welcome back. We will move to 191 Colony Street. So, Mr. Assessor, you can proceed.
Okay, So, for this one, just before we get started, I do have a rec that I came up with this morning that I don't know if the applicant would accept it or not, but did you want me to read it out?
Yeah, well, read the initial information first and then proceed with your recommendation.
Okay, so I have file number 24-1324, roll number 1209-148-6000, roll year 2025, assessed value 2,509,000, classification 20, liability T. So the recommendation I have would be for 2,121,000.
Okay, and
Sorry, could you repeat that again, Mr. Assessor?
2,121,000.
Okay, thank you.
okay, and what's that based on?
So it's based on just a recalculation of their net operating income to come out to 113,497. And then,
113,497.
yeah, and then using our model cap rate of 5.35%.
Okay, Ms. Applicant, how do you feel about that number? I know it's just still a fair difference.
Yeah, I appreciate the offer from the assessor, but just because I haven't had an opportunity to present it to the client, I would just have to proceed because we are still a bit a ways. But I do appreciate the rec.
Okay, Mr. Sesser, you can then proceed with your rest of your presentation if you wish.
Okay, for sure. Okay, so we have so continuing on, I'm still recommending that value on the department. I'll touch on it as we go through. We do have a 3-story apartment, same neighborhood, 1929 built, 34 suites. You could see here where it's located. Actually, it's just kind of, this one's more north of Broadway, not south of Broadway, in that triangle by the Memorial Park. So you could see there on page 2 where it's located there, just kind of north and really close to the park area Memorial. If we look here, the income value summary, so what I had changed on here that it shows would be their effective gross income. I had went to 259,000, which is more closer to what they have reported to us if you look on page 9. So I went 259,000 on the effective gross income. And then the expense ratio, I still used 145,503. It just brought their net operating income down to 113,497 from the 134,256. And so that's where I would come up with the value of 2,121,000 using that 5.35% cap rate. So scrolling forward, I won't touch on the rent comparables. This will bring the rents down further. I don't know how much per unit that works out to, but it'll be less, probably under 700, just under $700 a unit. But it would still fall in line with these other properties that are kind of in that neighborhood there, around the subject property. Now, when we go to capitalization rates, we have been discussing this as from all the prior properties. Same type of building we have, older, very close in terms of location. We see again our model caps 4.75 to 5.45. We're coming in at 5.35. We feel that's also further supported again by those sales on page 6. And if we just scroll down here, I know on page 8 I provided, they submitted the questionnaire for rents. So you could see where their rents are. On page 9, you could see where they come in on the rental income. And you could see their operating expenses. depreciation interest should not be included. There's also the issue that I've seen crop up with these properties that we're gonna be touching on the wages. These wages numbers are quite high and like, I don't really know what's gone into them. It's definitely the largest chunk that it's eating towards the expense ratio, which is really quite uncommon for properties. So when I based my recommendation, I was looking more on the 2021 rate of 24,929. It's just, yeah, like from a, like to do a stabilization on it, like I would really need to know what's gone into that. Like it's just so outside the norm of operating a regular market apartment, that it makes it hard for us to stabilize a value like that. But again, moving forward, the last page there, just I was able from their website, they had a picture of the property. I know we have no effective age. You could see by the picture, it probably could be warranted an effective age bump relative to just looking at what these pictures are. They've obviously updated. Some of the exterior looks pretty well maintained, windows. The exterior again, yeah, looks, the brick looks nice. And again, it just gives you a write-up of the neighborhood. So located to all necessities, you know, you're close walking distance to various retail outlets, as it states there, close to bus routes. So it is actually, I think, a location that is still fairly good. There's a lot of people in this type of market that are sought after for these type of rentals. It's close to the University of Winnipeg, which is also another positive. So I don't see where there would be, you know, issues with this one in terms of a location restriction as well. So 2,121,000, that's our final recommendation here. And other than that, that will conclude my presentation.
Okay, any questions, Ms. Applicant?
Just a couple. So just a matter of clarification, I know you didn't touch on it, but just because it's in the brief, I just wanted to clarify the sale. On page 2, that would be a multi-parcel sale, which is for 191, 199, and 209. Right?
Sorry, what the,
On your page 2, the subject sale history, I just wanted to clarify that just because it is in the brief. I know you didn't mention it, but
the August, I'm only showing a sale from August 2003.
yeah, so that's the sale. I just wanted to
Oh.
clarify if you were aware that it was just a multi-parcel.
Oh, no, I didn't. I mean, it's a while back, so I didn't really factor that in. But
Mhm.
thank you.
And then just final question. So you mentioned being close to the U of Winnipeg as a positive, but is that typically considered a positive, being close to U of Winnipeg as compared to U of Manitoba?
I would, I mean, it's sees demand, right? So it's, I mean, the area, again, you debate that the area is not as good locationally with crime, etc., but the property still sees the demand that places need to be rented. So that's where I would say it's positive.
Okay, thank you. That would conclude my questions on this property.
Okay, Ms. Benner, any questions?
No questions for me, thank you.
Mr. Colatriglio?
I have no questions at this point either. Thank you.
Okay, I have no questions, so you can begin your presentation, Ms. Applicant.
Thank you. So if you turn to page 2, you'll see our requested assessment of 1,483,000. On page 6, we have our property maps and some exterior photos. Page 8, we have our property description. So the subject property is on the east side of Colony between its intersections with York and Broadway. The property was built in 1929. There are 34 units, which are predominantly smaller suites, 19 bachelor units, and 15 one-bedrooms. There is no parking noted at the property. So on page 13, we have the start of our income approach. So we did have some dispute on the NOI on this one, but I believe the assessor has kind of addressed that in his commentary. So I'll just move along to the cap rate on page 14. We are disputing the cap rate of 5.35% that's applied by the model. And we're using a cap rate of 6.25% based on our cap rate study. So structurally, 1929 puts us in the same range, 6.1 to 6.6. It is wood frame. There's no parking. So we're at 6.25, similar to and consistent with the other properties that we've looked at today. So if you turn to page 16, we have our income and expense stabilization. So their effective gross income that they're taking in 2022 is $258,220, and that's what's applied in our analysis. Now we've gone through for the purpose of stabilization, and you'll see that we removed the wages and benefits from 2022. So typically wages are something that would go up over time, and we would use the most current year. But in this case, since there did seem to be quite a big jump and it looks like it could possibly be combined for properties, and without knowing for sure what was going on there, I've decided just to stabilize at the lower amount of 2021 to kind of maintain consistency with what they have reported for 2020. Our expenses include stabilized repair and maintenance at $1,370 per suite, for total expenses of $165,513. Gives us an NOI of $92,707. And with our 6.25% cap rate, gives us a rounded value of $1,483,000. You'll see our repair and maintenance breakdown on page 17 that shows everything line by line. No outliers were deemed to be there, so that's just all the figures as they're presented. And then the appendix starts on page 19. And what I've provided are some interior marketing photos that were from the website, as well as the financials that we've utilized in the analysis. And that would conclude my presentation on this property. Thank you.
Okay, questions, Mr. Assessor?
Yeah, just on the income with the wages there, and you know how there's I guess a percentage breakdown. You have 9.7% of expenses are allocated to wages. Would you do you have any idea what, say, a market norm would be for that?
Like the market norm for a caretaker?
Yeah.
We don't have like a market study of caretaking fees, but this amount doesn't seem, 24,900 or so doesn't seem to be out of line for a caretaker. Typically caretakers get a suite and then they'd also get some pay on top of that. So for me, for a caretaker for the full year, that doesn't seem to be out of line.
And then I guess just regarding the photos, so would you say that this property's been pretty well cared for? And it's not a huge renovation, but it just has kind of modest updates through the years?
Yeah, based on these photos and what I know of the property manager, the units are all fairly well maintained.
Okay.
And they likely do some upgrades upon turnovers.
Okay. Now, based on the just regarding application of caps, so where you list the capitalization rate, you guys have like pre-1946, 1946 to 1969 for effective year built. Should this effective year built, say we were in 1975 for effective year built because it's newer, would that be a consideration on Altus's part to change their cap rate range, or would it be restricted due to that it's an older structure?
We look at the effective year built assigned by the city within reason. So for example, I've had properties in the past where they're maybe built in the 1960s, they've had balconies replaced, cities assigned an effective age of 1975, 1980. That seems to make sense. But you know, with a property that's built in 1929, even if you do some modernizations, you're maybe looking at 1930 something, 1940, you're not looking at 1970s. So even if there was a 1970s effective age assigned, we wouldn't necessarily agree with that. So we evaluate the effective age assigned kind of on a case by case basis of where it makes sense. But at the end of the day as well, the effective age is more of an educated assumption by the assessment department rather than inputs that are going into a certain model and kind of coming up with a value in a defined way.
Those are all my questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Colatriglio, any questions?
Just a couple, if you don't mind. You touched on effective age. You think that there should be a change to the effective age on this property?
Like I said, if the assessor came through it and put something like in the 1930s or 1940, I wouldn't contest that. But a effective age that's much newer when structurally this is a 1920s building, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that.
Okay. And this doesn't have any parking whatsoever.
Yeah, it doesn't
So-
appear to, and they note it on their statements.
And yet,
Yeah.
and yet, one of the things I need to touch on is that because it doesn't have parking, some of the expenses that normally related to that aren't present in this particular property. Yet I'm finding that the expense percentage that you're applying is quite a bit higher than what we've seen in some of the other properties we've looked at today. Do you find that potentially maybe some of these expenses maybe aren't specific to this property based on the fact that it seems to be part of a group of properties in the immediate area?
It is part of a group of properties, but the statements that I received from the property manager and the broken down repair and maintenance are property specific. With that said, the wages and benefits, I'll admit, is an outlier, so I did remove that.
I saw that. I appreciate that.
But with the other expenses, they are all attributed to the property. I think one of the things to note would be that the level of expenses itself isn't necessarily out of line, but because their income is low, it creates a ratio that's higher. But, you know, we do see ratios in the 60s, approaching mid-60s, or even higher than that for some of these older properties because they don't have those efficiencies built in. And especially if properties are experiencing more turnover, there's going to be more like maintenance of suites. But when I look kind of line by line at the expenses, they all look to kind of be within reason of what we'd expect, you know, for insurance, taxes, utilities, repair and maintenance at 1370 is fairly modest. So there was nothing that really stood out as not being appropriate.
And as far as vacancy is concerned on the property, a fairly standard vacancy, I'm assuming. They don't show anything, I get that, but from what you've gathered, is it a fairly normal vacancy in this property?
Yeah, I mean, based on what we're seeing with the trends in the EGI, it looks like it's been fairly stable for a couple of years, maybe a bit more vacancy than 2020 with that bit of a drop in EGI. But there's nothing out of the ordinary here.
Okay. Those are my questions, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Penner, any questions?
My questions were just answered, so thank you, I'm good.
All right, thank you very much for that. Then we'll move on to 199 Colony. Again, I'll have a moment to open the files. Okay, Mr. Assessor, on 199 Colony.
Okay, the file number 24 dash 1325, roll number 120914888000. Roll number or roll year 2025, assessed value 1,807,000, classification 20, liability T. We have a 3-story apartment, one building, built in 1928. This is very similar to the previous one. In fact, I believe they're kind of all right beside each other in the same row. This one has 30 suites and no parking, again, reported to us. We see the location again, right by Memorial Park, right next door to the previous property. This one though with 30 units instead of 34, so slightly less. You could see where we're coming in, average monthly rent per unit. Our gross potential rents make up 238,795. After we subtract our market vacancy, we're looking at 230,198 for effective gross income. Expense ratio, we're at 58.01%, which it would be on the higher end for expenses. So that brings our net operating income to 96,660 with capitalization rate 5.35%. That gets us our estimated market value. Now, rent comparables, again, you could see here where that falls in line with similar properties in the area, and it also falls in line to what they've been reporting to us. So we feel good where we are with the income. Cap rate, we touched on it, same as previous property here on page 5 and 6, same type of notions that I would say would be presented for the previous property would be applicable to this one. Now, if we keep scrolling again, here's their income statement. And so you can see at the top where it says 191, 199, 209 Colony on page 8. So they've clearly grouped some stuff together with these properties that we have. Now they list here, here's their rental and other income. I don't know what's gone into it. I'm assuming this is after vacancy and everything's been applied, if there is any vacancy on their end, but it's pretty stable between 230 and 233. Again, operating expenses, I mean, looking at this, I would remove the depreciation, as you could see, the interest, as you could see, would come out. Wages, they're between 35,000 and 15,000. So again, a big variation, and it looks like in 2022, when you look at the previous property, the wages were 72,000. This one, it's 35,000. So I just, again, I have a hard, like, it was really hard for me to stabilize this one because the numbers are so erratic with the expenses that you normally wouldn't see in a typical market apartment that's being reported. I mean, I'm looking at 96,660 with our model. This one here in 2021, they had an 80,000 NOI, but if you subtracted their interest and depreciation, would bring you closer in line to what our model is now. In 2022, the expenses jumped 40,000 and yet the income went down. So I don't know if this is a case where maybe there's been more renovations are being put in here, but I'm gonna defer to our model in this one on what we presented for NOI and cap rate. Being that our expenses are already at 58.01%. So that's already on the higher end as well from a market perspective. And so I'm gonna stick with our 1,807,000 for this one, and that's all I have for this presentation.
Okay, questions, Ms. Applicant?
No new questions, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Benner?
Do you, I understand there's an expense ratio that we're using here. In your questioning of the wages, is there a rate or a percentage that you would expect to be more reasonable for property like this?
I mean, I would think like stuff we see with that, that's why I had questioned just about the percentage breakdown. I mean, just under 10% of similar to how the prior subject was stabilized, being that we're all in the same block here, would be more reasonable for expense ratio. Like when we're putting that in an expense ratio, but that's about how I guess I would have to approach it. And even a buyer themselves, like when a buyer's looking at this apartment, from a market perspective, they're coming in and they may not have the same expenses that maybe these wages would list to, right? So that's why I just would defer to our model, being that it was pretty close to 2021 when we kind of looked at the numbers there. And so it just seemed like that would have been more indicative of this property's income.
Thank you, that was all for me.
Okay, Mr. Colatriglio.
It does seem odd that the expenses have gone up from 2021 to 22 by $40,000. It just seems kind of odd, period, doesn't it? Just being part, certainly the lion's share of that. The other one is gas charges.
Yeah. Yeah, again, like and some of these older buildings, I can kind of get behind maybe some of the utility costs have gone up on some of these older buildings, but when I see like the stuff like wages, which is again, that's so outside of the norm of market apartments, when you see that much allocated towards an expense breakdown, I don't have that answer, unfortunately. Unless part of the wages is part of the repair and maintenance in terms of them paying people to come fix the apartment. That's the only thing that I could maybe attribute to that.
That's a year by year thing that could change.
Correct.
And so you felt that the model driven expenses was more reasonable to go with?
Well, 58.01%. I mean, when we're looking at that from a model driven perspective, and a lot of the prior properties we've talked about today that are older, where expense ratios were in the low 50s, it's just, it makes it hard from again, I'm thinking from a market mass appraisal standpoint, like when I see this, that I feel like 58% is pretty reasonable.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
All right, and I have no questions, so Ms. Applicant, you can begin your presentation.
Thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have our requested assessment of $1,260,000. On page 6, we have some maps and exterior photographs. Page 8, we have our property description, so it is adjacent to the previous property, built in 1928, has a 1934 effective age assigned. There are 30 units, which include 15 bachelors, 11 one-bedrooms, and 4 two-bedrooms, and there is no parking noted. So our income approach starts on page 13. There was a bit of dispute on the expenses. Our income was pretty much identical to the city's income, but we do have a higher expense ratio. On page 14, we have our cap rate overview. Same as the prior property, we're going in at 6.25% for similar factors. We have our workup on page 16. So again, on page 16, The effective gross income, they're reporting just income after vacancy, that's $230,019. For expenses, nothing really looked out of the ordinary with the exception of wages. So again, I've just stabilized using the 2021 wages, which are $15,853. Our expenses include repair and maintenance stabilized at $1,273, which is again, pretty modest repair and maintenance allowance. So that gives us total expenses of $151,243. We have an NOI of $78,776. And with a 6.25% cap rate, that gives us a rounded value of $1,260,000. On page 17, we have our repair and maintenance breakdown. So again, nothing really looked out of the ordinary, so nothing was removed from the analysis. And our appendix starts on page 19, again, some interior marketing photos, as well as the financials that we've used in our analysis. And that would conclude my presentation on this property. Thank you.
Okay, questions, Mr. Assessor?
Yeah, and so this would be on, say, the application of the cap rates. So in your cap rate study, with the property, say the one on Maryland, the expense ratio on that property to get that cap rate was sub 50%. This expense ratio here, 65.8%. And we know what having a higher net income can do on a cap rate sale. So that being said, do you think it's fair to be pulling, those type of cap rates when the expense ratios are 20% apart on these older properties?
Well, I think we have to be a bit careful with the ratios. It can be a good tool to look as a measurement, but when we're looking here, when the income is low, the ratios are going to look higher, but 65% kind of hovering around there on an older property, it is not unreasonable. When we look at market apartments from, 70s and beyond, we're seeing expense ratios mid 50s to 60%, sometimes higher. So with a building this old at 65 roughly percent, it does make sense. And certain charges are just going up each year too. So it does make sense that expenses rise each year regardless of income, because certain things are constantly going up. So again, in terms of the overall expenses, I don't think they're unreasonable, but because the rent is low, the ratio looks higher.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't have really that much issue with the NOI as opposed to how the cap rate just gets pulled from sort of the sales that have expense ratios that aren't even close to what the subject gets stabilized at. So I guess that's where I was kind of going with that questioning, is in terms of, is it fair to just pull that and apply it here when they're not the same breakdowns?
Well, when we're looking at apartment stabilizations, we stabilize based on actual income expenses. That's based on the Marion Holdings decision, and cap rate is a function, it is a market parameter, it is a function of that. But we try to make it site specific as possible. So I don't really see the issue with stabilizing based on the actuals and then looking to the market for the cap rate, because that's how the cap rates are derived. We have to look to market sales and market evidence.
Okay, and in your cap rate evidence that you had presented through your analysis, those didn't have fully stabilized sales, correct?
I don't agree with that statement.
Okay. Okay, those are all my questions. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Colatriglio, any questions?
I think that the assessors kind of touched on it. My problem is, again, the expenses seem to be, and I appreciate there's going to be ebb and flow in all expenses, and you can see that clearly in your evidence. No, there's nothing specific I need to ask. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Okay, Ms. Banner.
I don't have any questions, thank you.
All right, I have no questions, so we'll go on to our last property, which is 209 Colony. And once again, I will open the files.
A second.
Okay, on 209 Colony.
Okay, just give me one moment here. Okay, good. Okay, so we have file number 24-1328, roll number 1209-149-0000. Roll year 2025, assessed value 2,066,000, classification 20, liability T. We have a 3-story right beside the other two that we had just discussed. They're almost similar type properties in terms of when they were built. This was built in 1929, 31 suites on this one. The prior was 30, so very close. This does have 9 outdoor parking allocated to it. You could see again location on page 2. We touched on that. We know where it's located. And you could see now we get to our income breakdown on page 3 from the city. So we have our breakdown coming out to 674.26 per unit, which gives you the gross potential rent of 250,825. And subtracting vacancy, we get an effective gross income of 241,795. Expense ratio here is 54.28%. And net operating income coming in at 110,549, capitalization rate 5.35%, to come up with our market value. So cap rate has been the same applied for these 3 properties in a row. So we feel good with the consistency there. And just some rents here on page 5 page 4 that would back up where this property falls in line with similar ones in the neighborhood. And capitalization rate on page 5, we've touched on that. We've touched on our cap rate evidence on how it's applied here in this situation as we did with the prior properties. Now, again, owner has submitted, and this, again, I had just kind of noticed this when I was going through this one. We do have outdoor parking and it says no parking. So that's obviously something on our end that we need to correct. And so that's something that we can adjust. I don't know how much that would affect our overall income calculation in terms of making us how much of a gap there would be there. But I did notice that once this was submitted that we do say no, it does say no parking. So that is something on our end we're gonna have to correct. Similar to previous 2, you could see how the income and expenses are grouped in the 1 year in 2021. Expenses outpaced income. There's a large repair and maintenance that has gone into the property. I don't know what was put into that from a repair and maintenance side. Potentially capital expenditures have been lumped into that. Wages again, really on the high level. So when I'm looking at this property from, again, a market standpoint and the way our model has assessed this one, given the information that's been applied on the income and expenses, and I look at that, at least our effective gross income at 241,795, it does match up close to what they've reported in 2022 and 2021. So I feel good here from an income side of things on our model. But again, expenses to really stabilize this, I just have to defer to the model expenses. I mean, we're at 54.28 and when we've looked at all the expenses in the market, you could see from the sales that have been provided by the applicant where expense ratios kind of fall. That gives you an idea of market expenses. And I would say that we're slightly above that. So I feel comfortable in where our valuation still is, given that the information is really difficult to sift through. And this is one where I would say an inspection is probably warranted for sure because of how high that repair and maintenance cost is. That I wasn't able to garner any pictures interiorly of this one, but I did post on page 10. You can see the outside of it. Similar to the other one, reasonably maintained. Looks like windows have definitely been done. Don't know what the suites look like though, so but this is one that would probably really need to be updated from an inspection side. Other than that, that's everything I have for my presentation today. Thank you.
Okay, questions, Ms. Applicant?
No new questions, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Banner?
I think you basically just touched on it, but one question I had, that kind of popped up when you were talking about the expense statement is going back to that effective age and, if there is, some higher than average funds being put into the building and on a repair and maintenance budget, would that, translate to a higher effective age for you, or would that only be based on an inspection?
Well, usually when there is large chunks of, well, I'll say capital at this point being put in, like that's where you would see an effective age bump because there has been a pretty large scale undertaking inside the property of some sort. But I wasn't able to gather any information on it, so. It would really be an inspection, but yes, it would constitute, I would say, highly likely an effective age increase.
And then I just noticed on this snip of the building, it does say outdoor parking available. I guess maybe we'll hear more about that in the other presentation, but yeah, so maybe there's somewhere in the middle.
No, and I mean, these are things sometimes too, right? Owners will report to us information, but yet we may look at and see otherwise. So it could be maybe an accounting error on their part. Like we see these properties look like they've been kind of grouped together. So I don't know where that may be coming from. They don't give a breakdown of their income either. So it's really, it's a guessing game for me.
That's all for me, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Colatriglio?
I'll pass also, thank you.
Okay, thank you then. Ms. Applicant, you can proceed.
Okay, thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have our requested assessment of $1,467,000. I'll just skip ahead to our income approach as everything's fairly similar to the prior properties. So if you go to page 16, we have our income valuation breakdown. So we're using their effective gross income of $245,396. All expenses seem fairly in line. Wages did go up, but they didn't look quite as high as the other ones. So I've just stuck with our usual format of averaging when we typically would and using the most recent year for otherwise. We've stabilized repair and maintenance at $1,478 per suite. So if you turn to page 17, you'll see the deductions that were made for taking out kind of that capital work. So in 2021, the roof was removed. So $1,478 for a building like this is, again, pretty low to modest repair and maintenance with some of the outliers that we removed. So that is properly stabilized and is a reasonable amount. gives us a net operating income of $91,687. And with 6.25% capitalization, we have a rounded value of $1,467,000. They do consistently report on their income statements, as you'll see in my appendix, no parking. So in regard to discrepancy with the website, I can't say for sure. They do say no parking repeatedly. And even if there were some parking, the effective gross income is going to encompass everything at the property. So even if there is a couple stalls, that would be accounted for. But I'm going to rely on the owner information as submitted to the city. They do sign those certifications that this is the accurate information. So I have no reason to believe that that information submitted wouldn't be true, but regardless, everything would be captured in the income and expenses as it stands. Appendix starts on page 19, and you'll see some interior marking photographs. These may be identical photographs they use for all of the properties. It's a bit hard to say, but this was what was on their specific website for this property. And then all of the financials to follow. And that would conclude my presentation on this property. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Colatriglio, any questions?
I was, sorry, just give me a moment.
I think the assessor.
Oh, sorry, yeah, assessor, yes, you're right. I was ahead of my time again.
No, just a question, going to the stabilization here. With the wages and caretaking, out of the expense percentage breakdown, it's 19.4% higher than any other line item for the expenses. Would you say that that's quite outside the norm?
I don't know that it's outside the norm in terms of looking at the trends for previous years. It does tend to increase each year, so it seems appropriate. But yeah, again, like we don't do a market study on caretaking fees, but you know, if you had a couple caretakers at this property, the allocation of wages, to me, it's not a huge red flag. But if the board's more comfortable, they could use one of the previous years of wages and benefits instead.
And that's the other thing why I just wanted to touch on, because these properties are identical, how all of a sudden this one has seen like a 10% bump, and it's now the largest chunk out of the expense allocation. So that's why I just needed to bring up and where it just didn't seem to align, but thank you for your explanation. And other than that, I think cap rate, we've touched on, so no further questions. Thank you.
All right, now, Mr. Colatriglio, it's your turn.
Thank you. I'm gonna kind of jump backwards for a moment, Mr. Chairman. Please forgive me, but Mr. Assessor, are you aware of permits on this property being pulled?
I am not.
Okay. Ms. Cates, obviously there's been a roof repair or a roof replacement done in 2021. Would that be the case? Do you know that for a fact, or?
Yeah, I requested the detailed repair and maintenance statements from the client, and yeah, it looks like a roof replacement, because the previous years are like 7,000, 1,000, 3,000. I would probably more point to a repair.
Okay.
So this would look like a roof replacement. Roofs need to be replaced every 25 years or so.
Yeah.
So that makes sense that over the life of the property, you'd have to replace the roof a few times.
Yep. And would you agree with me that there should be probably an effective age change because of the roof being replaced on this?
I'll echo my comments as I did for some of the previous, one of the previous ones we dealt with, 1928 build, the assessor is assigned a 1934, 1935 effective age. If they were to do something like that, I wouldn't object, but roof replacement is pretty typical repair for the property.
But it would extend the economic life, correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you let your roof go unrepaired for too long.
Kind of a chicken and egg thing. If you let the roof go, then the rest goes. It's all bad. And it also seems that way with the HVAC mechanical. It seems to vary quite a bit. through the expenses you show us on page 17 of your report, correct?
Yeah, it appears a more average amount would be around the $7,000 range rather than 16,000 or 17,000. So I did opt to remove 2019 and 20 from the stabilized amount just to account for that and be as reasonable as possible. Yeah,
Do you know what those higher amounts from 2020 through 2022, what they were associated with specifically? Were they boiler exchanges? Like, do you have any idea what was actually done?
I mean, on the statements, they just listed as HVAC mechanical, so I don't know the
Fair enough.
specifics, but
I was just wondering if maybe they had shared that with you potentially, but obviously that's not the case, but no problem. None whatsoever. Just trying to understand the property a bit better. I think those are my questions. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Penner.
No questions for me, thank you.
Right, and I have no questions. So, summation, Mr. Assessor.
Yeah, just a summation overall of the docket in terms of the application of cap rates. We believe that we presented sound quality evidence of stabilized cap rate sales in terms of supporting the model cap rates that have been applied to all these properties on the docket. So thank you very much.
Okay, Ms. Applicant.
I would just ask the board to consider the site-specific factors of the properties that we're dealing with today, specifically location, age. There's been a lot of talk about potential effective age, but at the end of the day, nothing's been applied. So we have to go with what's in place, and as I've been kind of echoing, even if there was an effective age, structurally, the buildings are from the early 1900s, and I just feel all of those should be considered, and that the actual income and expenses should be relied upon over the model. Thank you.
All right, so we have heard all the properties on the agenda today, so this hearing is now closed. Thank you both for your very capable presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay, and we'll take just a quick break and then come back for the board to deliberate.